Have you ever felt like something was wrong, but only understood what it was after everything fell apart? As if you had lived for years inside an illusion without realizing you were playing a role that was never truly yours. That realization rarely comes gently. It shows up when something you depended on stops working, when effort no longer brings meaning, when the life you built starts to feel strangely unfamiliar, and suddenly, what once felt normal now feels staged, almost artificial. This is the moment when it finally clicks, and there's no going back. Not because everything changes on the outside, but because something shifts inside you. A quiet recognition forms. You weren't just living your life, you were playing a game you never consciously chose. And once you see that, a question naturally arises, one that carries both fear and clarity at the same time. What happens when you finally see what you've been playing all along? Before answering that, pause for a moment. Notice your breath. Notice that you are aware right now. That awareness was present before the role, before the rules, before the game itself, and that's where everything truly begins. Before you ever had a chance to ask what you wanted, the rules were already on the table. No one sat you down and said, "Here is the game, do you accept?" It didn't happen that way. It was quieter, more subtle. It arrived through tone, repetition, and reward, through what was praised and what was ignored, through what brought approval and what brought silence. You learned the rules long before you had the language to question them. As a child, you watched closely. You noticed which behaviors were met with smiles and which caused tension in the room. You felt in your body when it was safer to agree than to speak, when it was better to perform than to pause. So you adapted. Not because you were weak, but because you were human. Belonging mattered, safety mattered, love mattered. That's how the game enters, not as oppression but as conditioning dressed up as care. Be realistic. Don't rock the boat. That's just how life is. These phrases weren't meant to trap you. They were inherited, passed down by people who were also playing, also adapting, also surviving inside a system they never consciously chose. And so the game kept going, not because anyone was evil, but because it was familiar. Success was defined for you before you could define yourself. Stability was praised over truth, achievement over alignment. You were shown images of what a good life looks like, and slowly, without realizing it, you aimed yourself in that direction. Not because it felt deeply right, but because it felt expected. And expectation is powerful. The game taught you what to chase and what to avoid. It taught you that worth must be proven, not assumed. That rest must be earned. That doubt is dangerous. That questioning too much leads to isolation. Over time, these ideas didn't feel imposed anymore. They felt like your own thoughts. That's the most effective part of the game, when its rules start speaking in your voice. You might say, "But I chose my career. I chose my relationships. I chose this life." And on the surface, that's true. You made decisions, you took actions. But look closer. Look at the range of options you felt allowed to consider. Look at the fears that quietly shaped your choices. Look at how often you asked, "Will this work?" before asking, "Is this true for me?" Choice inside a narrow frame still feels like freedom until the frame becomes visible. The game didn't need to force you. It only needed to teach you what not to question. So you learned to adjust yourself, to smooth your edges, to silence parts of you that didn't fit neatly into the script. Curiosity became impractical. Sensitivity became weakness. Stillness became laziness. And anything that couldn't be measured, compared, or validated was slowly pushed aside. None of this happened overnight. It happened through repetition, through routines, through subtle feedback loops that rewarded compliance and gently corrected deviation. And because it was gradual, it felt normal, it felt like life. But deep down, something in you noticed, not as a clear thought, more like a tension, a quiet sense of misalignment. Moments where you'd pause and feel a strange distance from your own life, as if you were living inside a structure that didn't quite fit your shape. You may have brushed it off. Everyone feels this sometimes, you told yourself. This is just adulthood. This is responsibility. Yet the feeling returned, in small cracks. in late-night exhaustion that sleep didn't fix, in achievements that felt strangely hollow, in conversations where you said the right things but didn't feel present in your own words. That's not failure. That's awareness trying to surface. The game doesn't announce itself as a game. It presents itself as reality, as the way things are. And when something is framed as reality, questioning it feels dangerous. You risk being labeled naive, difficult, unrealistic. So most people don't question it. They adjust themselves instead. But the cost of adjustment is subtle. You don't lose everything at once. You lose contact little by little with your own inner signals. You stop trusting what you feel and start trusting what's expected. You become efficient, functional, productive, and quietly disconnected. And still, you keep playing. Because everyone around you is playing too. What no one tells you is that the game depends on unconscious participation. It requires that you remain identified with the role you're performing, that you believe this character, this adapted version of you, is who you are. But there comes a moment, often uninvited, when something shifts, when the discomfort grows just enough that you can't ignore it anymore, when the world around you starts to feel slightly off, like a set you've been walking through for years without noticing the seams. And that's usually when something new begins to happen. Not externally, internally. You start to notice yourself. Not judge, not fix. Just notice your reactions, your patterns, the automatic yes, the familiar tightening when you consider doing something different. It's subtle, but it's different from before. It's as if a small distance opens up between you and the role you've been playing. And once that distance appears, even briefly, the next stage of the game becomes impossible to ignore. At some point, adapting stopped being something you did and became someone you were. The character didn't appear all at once. It was built slowly, layer by layer, as you responded to what the world seemed to require from you. You learned how to speak in certain rooms, how to hold your face in certain situations, how to present a version of yourself that caused the least friction. Over time, that version became familiar, reliable, safe. And familiarity has a way of convincing you it's the truth. You may not remember when you first stepped into the role. It likely happened so early that there was no clear line between before and after. One day you were just being, and the next you were adjusting, smiling when something didn't land, agreeing when something didn't sit right, saying, "I'm fine," because it was easier than explaining what you couldn't yet name. The world responded well to this version of you. That's important. The character worked, it got approval, it avoided conflict, it helped you move forward. And because it worked, you kept refining it. You sharpened the edges that were rewarded and hid the parts that weren't. You learned what to show and what to keep private, sometimes even from yourself. Eventually, the character felt like me. But notice something subtle. When you talk about who you are, how often are you describing behaviors, roles, or achievements? Your job, your responsibilities, your personality traits. These are not lies, but they are not the whole truth either. They are descriptions of how you function in the game, not of what you are beneath it. The character is a response, it's a strategy. It's how you learn to survive, connect, and succeed within the rules you were given. And strategies are useful, they are not wrong. The problem begins when you forget they are strategies at all. That forgetting creates a quiet tension. You might feel it when you're alone, when there's no one to perform for, when the noise drops and you're left with yourself. There's a strange restlessness there, or a dull heaviness, or a sense that you should be doing something even when there's nothing to do. That's the character looking for its next cue, because the character is always working. It monitors, it evaluates, it asks, "Am I doing this right?" It worries about how things look. It measures progress. It compares. Even in moments that could be simple, the character stays alert, scanning for approval or threat. And over time, that constant vigilance becomes exhausting. You may call it stress, burnout, midlife confusion, but beneath those labels, there's often something more precise happening. The character is tired of pretending to be you. There are moments when the mask slips. Maybe you laugh too hard at something small. Maybe you feel unexpectedly emotional over a song, a memory, a quiet morning. Maybe you feel irritated by things that never bothered you before. These aren't flaws, they're cracks, small openings where something real presses against the surface. The character doesn't like these moments. They don't fit the script. They can't be easily explained or controlled. So they're often pushed aside, rationalized, labeled as weakness, moodiness, or distraction. The game prefers consistency. The character enforces it. But the cost of consistency is distance. Distance from your own inner signals, from the subtle sense of what feels true, alive, or aligned. The more skilled you become at playing the role, the harder it can be to hear anything beneath it. And yet something in you keeps trying. It shows up as a question you don't ask out loud. Is this it? It shows up as a feeling you can't quite name. It shows up as a longing without an object. The character has answers for everything except that. And here's the most important thing to notice. The character isn't bad. It's not your enemy. It was built with intelligence and care. It helped you navigate a complex world, but it was never meant to be your identity. It was meant to be a tool. When a tool is mistaken for the one who uses it, confusion follows. You may feel a subtle fear when this idea comes close. If I'm not this character, then who am I? And what happens if I stop holding it together? That fear is natural. The character has been protecting you for a long time. Letting go feels like risk. So instead of letting go, something else begins to happen first. You start to notice the character, not in a dramatic way, not with judgment, just small moments of recognition. Oh, that was automatic. That reaction didn't really come from me. I didn't actually feel what I just expressed. These moments are quiet, but they change the direction of attention. And once attention shifts from being inside the character to noticing it from a slight distance, a new layer of experience becomes available. It feels less like acting and more like watching, less like effort and more like space. And that's when the next realization starts to form, even if you don't have words for it yet. There is something in you that is not the role, not the mask, not the story you've been repeating. Something that sees the character without needing to fix it. Something that was never damaged by the game at all. Once the character is in place, the rules become clearer. You don't need to be reminded anymore. The game trains you through feedback. When you follow the script, things tend to move smoothly. When you question it, even gently, resistance appears. It rarely looks like punishment at first. It looks like raised eyebrows, awkward silence, a change in tone. You sense it immediately. Something in the room tightens. You learn, without anyone saying it directly, that certain questions make people uncomfortable, that some topics are better left alone, that going too far off script comes with a cost. So you adjust. Obedience is rewarded in subtle ways. Approval, stability, predictability, a feeling of being on track. When you comply, life seems to cooperate just enough to keep you going. Doors open. You're included. You're considered reasonable, mature, grounded. These rewards aren't flashy, but they're effective. They make the game feel safe. Questioning, on the other hand, carries a different energy. When you slow down instead of rushing, someone calls you unmotivated. When you ask why something matters, you're told you're overthinking. When you say no, the atmosphere shifts. It's not that anyone is trying to control you personally. The system corrects itself. People defend what they depend on. When you question the game, you threaten the sense of certainty it provides, not just for you, but for everyone around you. And uncertainty makes people uneasy, so the pressure comes in sideways. Don't make it harder than it needs to be. That's just how things work. You'll understand eventually. These phrases aren't arguments, they're closures. They end the conversation without addressing the question. And if you keep pressing, the response changes. Patience thins, labels appear. You're difficult, idealistic, negative, out of touch. Over time, you learn the cost-benefit calculation. You feel it before you think it. Is this question worth the tension? Is this truth worth the awkwardness? Often, the answer feels like no. Not because the question disappears, but because you've learned what happens when you voice it. So you swallow it. The game doesn't need to silence you completely. It only needs to make silence feel easier than honesty. And most of the time, it succeeds. What's important to see is that this conditioning doesn't just come from institutions or authority figures. It comes from peers, friends, family, colleagues. Anyone who has made peace with the game becomes an enforcer of its rules, usually without realizing it. When you question, you don't just challenge the system, you mirror back a doubt they've buried. That's uncomfortable. So the reward for obedience isn't just external success, it's social harmony, a sense of belonging, the relief of not being the one who complicates things. Humans are wired to protect connection. The game uses that wiring well, but something else happens alongside this conditioning. Each time you ignore a question that matters to you, something tightens inside. It's subtle, almost invisible, a small contraction, a quiet resignation. You tell yourself you're being practical, responsible, mature. Yet that contraction accumulates. You might notice it as a low-level irritability, a sense of boredom that doesn't go away, a feeling of living slightly ahead of or behind your own life. The game keeps you busy enough that you don't have to sit with these sensations for long. There's always something to do, something to improve, something to fix. Busyness is one of the game's most effective shields. Still, questions find ways to leak through. They appear when you're tired, when you're alone, when the usual rewards stop feeling rewarding. You might catch yourself thinking, who decided this was the right way? Or why does everyone pretend this makes sense? These thoughts come uninvited, and you often push them away just as quickly, because questioning doesn't just risk external disapproval. It threatens the identity you've built inside the game. If the rules aren't absolute, then the sacrifices you made under them come into question too. That's a heavy thing to face. So obedience continues, not because you fully believe, but because disbelief feels destabilizing. Yet something interesting happens when awareness begins to grow, even slightly. You start to notice the pattern itself, how often conformity is praised as wisdom, how dissent is framed as immaturity, how being realistic often means don't look too closely. You begin to see that the game doesn't actually reward truth, it rewards predictability. It doesn't punish questioning because questioning is wrong, but because questioning interrupts the flow. It slows things down. It introduces pause where momentum is valued. And once you see this, even dimly, your relationship to obedience changes. You might still comply on the surface, you might still play along, but internally something has shifted. You're no longer completely merged with the role. You're watching yourself comply, watching the reactions, watching the system respond. That observation creates space. In that space, the rewards of obedience start to feel thinner, less convincing. You begin to notice that approval doesn't actually bring peace. That stability without alignment feels empty. That fitting in at the cost of truth creates a quiet kind of loneliness. And at the same time, you notice something else. Despite all the pressure to conform, despite the subtle punishments for questioning, there is a part of you that hasn't gone away. A part that keeps noticing the falseness, a part that feels uneasy even when everything looks successful from the outside. That unease isn't a problem to solve, it's a signal, it's the first sign that the game's rewards are no longer working the way they used to. Even when things looked right on the surface, there was a quiet sense that something didn't add up. You followed the rules as best you could. You did what was expected. You reached milestones that were supposed to bring satisfaction. And for a moment, maybe they did. A brief sense of relief, a feeling of, okay, I'm on track. But it never lasted. Soon enough, the same hollow note returned, soft but persistent. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't feel like despair. It felt more like a low-grade dissonance, as if the life you were living and the life you were meant to live were slightly out of sync, close enough to function, but never quite aligned. You might have blamed yourself for this feeling. Maybe you thought you were ungrateful, too sensitive, expecting too much. After all, from the outside, things looked fine, better than fine sometimes. And when the world keeps telling you that you should be happy, dissatisfaction starts to feel like a personal failure. So you tried harder. You refined the character. You optimized your routines. You searched for the next improvement, the next upgrade, the next explanation that would finally make everything click. If something felt false, the game offered endless distractions to cover it up. New goals, new identities, new stories about who you were becoming. But the falseness didn't come from a lack of effort. It came from misalignment. There's a difference between a problem that needs solving and a signal that needs listening. This wasn't asking you to do more. It was asking you to notice something you'd been avoiding. And because the game trains you to fix, achieve, and move forward, listening felt unproductive, dangerous even. Yet the feeling persisted. You might have noticed it in moments of pause, on a quiet morning when nothing demanded your attention, in a conversation that stayed on the surface when you wanted depth, in laughter that felt a second late, like you were responding instead of expressing. It was the sense of performing life instead of inhabiting it. What made it confusing was that nothing was obviously wrong. You weren't in crisis. There was no clear disaster to point to, just a subtle sense that you were always slightly ahead of yourself or slightly absent from your own experience, like watching your life through a thin pane of glass. The game doesn't account for this feeling. There's no checkbox for feels real, so when it appears, it's easy to dismiss. But the body doesn't dismiss it so easily. It shows up as tension you can't explain, fatigue that rest doesn't fix, a restlessness that no achievement seems to calm. This is where many people turn the feeling inward and make it about their worth. Something must be wrong with me. But that interpretation only deepens the falsehood. The problem was never you. The problem was the assumption that the script was true. A life built on expectations can look complete while feeling empty, because expectations are external. They tell you how things should appear, not how they should feel. And when feeling is consistently overridden by appearance, the result is a quiet form of disconnection. You might still function well. You might even excel. But there's a numbness that creeps in, a flattening of experience. Joy becomes muted, curiosity fades. Everything starts to feel vaguely the same, even when circumstances change. This is not boredom, it's not depression in the traditional sense. It's the nervous system recognizing that it's living inside something artificial. False doesn't always mean fake in an obvious way. Sometimes it means misaligned, like wearing shoes that are only half a size too small. You can walk, you can run, but over time the discomfort becomes unavoidable. The game tells you to ignore that discomfort, to normalize it, to call it just life. And because everyone else seems to be managing, you assume this low-level strain is the price of adulthood, of responsibility, of being realistic. But deep down, you know the difference between effort and strain. Effort can be meaningful. Strain drains you. And this strain comes from holding a shape that isn't yours, from constantly translating your inner world into something acceptable, from living according to rules that don't account for your actual experience. What makes this stage important is that the falseness becomes harder to ignore, not louder necessarily, but clearer. It stops feeling like a personal mood and starts feeling like a mismatch between inner truth and outer structure. You may begin to notice moments where the gap widens, when someone speaks with confidence about something that feels obviously empty to you, when a celebration feels oddly hollow, when success arrives and, instead of relief, you feel a strange sadness you can't explain. These moments don't destroy the game, they weaken its grip. They create tiny pauses where you stop reacting automatically and start sensing. Not thinking, sensing. The body knows before the mind does. It knows when something is off. It knows when you're living out of alignment, even if you don't yet know what alignment would look like. This sensing doesn't give you answers, it gives you unease. And unease is uncomfortable because it doesn't point forward. It pulls attention inward, it slows you down, it interrupts the momentum the game depends on. So you may try to outrun it. But something has already changed. The falseness has been named, at least internally. You can't fully unsee it. Even when you distract yourself, even when you go back to playing along, there's a quiet awareness running underneath, a growing sensitivity to what feels real and what doesn't. And as that sensitivity sharpens, it naturally begins to turn your attention outward again. Not to judge the world, but to notice how much of it feels slightly off, slightly rushed, slightly disconnected. That's when the discomfort stops feeling personal and starts to feel contextual. That's when you begin to look around and think, even if you don't say it out loud, something about this doesn't make sense. The discomfort doesn't announce itself as awakening. It feels more like irritation. You begin to notice the world around you in a different way. Conversations sound repetitive. Urgency feels exaggerated. So many people seem busy, stressed, reactive, yet no one can clearly say what they're actually moving toward. It's not that you think you're better than anyone else, it's that something about the rhythm feels off. Small things start to bother you. Noise that never used to register. Endless opinions delivered with absolute certainty. The way everyone seems to be in a hurry, but rarely present. You catch yourself thinking, why does everything feel so forced? And then immediately second-guessing yourself. Because the world hasn't changed overnight. You have. The game doesn't like this stage. It prefers comfort or crisis, not quiet noticing. Discomfort without a clear reason is hard to categorize, so it's often dismissed. You may tell yourself you're just tired, burned out, overexposed. And maybe you are. But that explanation doesn't fully land. The discomfort has a specific quality. It's not anger, it's not sadness. It's a subtle resistance in your body when you move through certain spaces, offices, meetings, social gatherings, online noise. You participate, but something in you stays slightly withdrawn, as if it's watching the scene instead of being inside it. You may start to feel like an outsider in places where you once felt normal. Again, this doesn't come with clarity. It comes with friction, a sense that the world is moving too fast or too mechanically, or without enough depth. People talk, but they don't seem to listen. They react, but they don't reflect. Everything feels optimized, efficient, and strangely empty at the same time. This is usually where self-doubt enters. Maybe I'm just cynical. Maybe I'm losing my edge. Maybe this is just getting older. Those explanations help you tolerate the discomfort, but they don't dissolve it. Because what you're responding to isn't the world itself, but your changing relationship to it. You're no longer fully immersed. The more aware you become, the more you notice how much of daily life runs on autopilot. The same complaints repeated like scripts. The same ambitions chased without question. The same emotional reactions triggered again and again, as if nothing new is actually happening. This can feel isolating. You look around and wonder if anyone else sees it. Everyone seems so certain, so invested, and you don't want to sound arrogant or detached, so you keep your observations to yourself. You nod, you play along. But internally, there's distance. The discomfort sharpens in environments where performance is rewarded over presence, where speed is valued more than understanding, where complexity is flattened into slogans and talking points. You feel it in your chest, in your jaw, in your breath. A quiet tension that builds without a clear outlet. This is not because the world is wrong and you are right. It's because awareness creates contrast. When you're fully inside the game, everything feels normal. When awareness begins to emerge, normal starts to feel strange. Not bad, just oddly constructed. Like stage lighting, you suddenly notice after years of focusing on the actors. And once you notice the lighting, you can't completely ignore it again. You might also notice a growing sensitivity to inauthenticity, forced enthusiasm, polite dishonesty, conversations that avoid anything real. It's not that you demand depth all the time, it's that emptiness now registers as emptiness instead of being glossed over. This can be confusing because awareness doesn't automatically bring peace. At first it brings friction. You see more, but you don't yet know what to do with what you see. The game is still running. You're still participating, but you're no longer fully convinced, so the world feels louder, sharper, more absurd at times. You might feel the urge to withdraw, to simplify, to step back, not out of superiority but out of a need to breathe, to feel something real. Silence becomes attractive, nature, slower rhythms, spaces where there's less performance and more presence. These are not escapes, they're calibrations. Your system is trying to reorient itself, even if you don't consciously intend it to. The discomfort is a signal that your internal tempo no longer matches the external one. And instead of forcing yourself to adapt again, something in you hesitates. That hesitation is new. It creates tiny pauses in your reactions, moments where you don't immediately agree, moments where you don't rush to fill silence, moments where you simply observe what's happening around you, without the need to jump in or fix anything. And in those pauses, another shift begins. You start to notice not just the world, but your responses to it. How quickly irritation arises. How often judgment appears. How the body reacts before the mind forms an opinion. You begin to see patterns, not just out there, but in here. The discomfort with the world becomes a mirror. It shows you where you're still entangled, where expectations still hook you, where the character still reacts automatically. And instead of blaming the world or yourself, something else starts to happen. Attention turns inward, not to analyze, but to watch. And that's when a new kind of noticing quietly enters the scene. At first, it's barely noticeable. You're still living your life, still doing what needs to be done, still responding to the world the way you always have. But something subtle has shifted. Between a trigger and your reaction, there's now a small gap, just enough space for awareness to slip in. You catch yourself mid-reaction, not to stop it, not to fix it, just to notice it. A familiar irritation rises, and instead of being completely inside it, you sense it forming. A tightening in the chest, a rush of thought, a story beginning to assemble, and alongside all of that, there's something else present. Quiet, unmoved, watching. This is new. Before, emotions felt like facts. Thoughts felt like commands. Now they feel more like events, movements, patterns that arise and pass. You're still affected by them, but not entirely consumed. You might notice this while speaking. You hear your own voice and realize you're saying something out of habit, not conviction. Or while listening, you sense the urge to interrupt before the words even reach your mouth. Or while scrolling, you feel the pull, the reflex, the automatic reach for distraction. And there it is again. That slight distance. This isn't detachment in a cold sense. It's not dissociation. It's intimacy of a different kind. You're closer to your experience, not farther away. You're noticing how the machinery works. At times, this can feel unsettling. If you've spent your whole life identified with your reactions, seeing them from the outside can feel like losing ground. You might wonder, if I'm not fully inside my thoughts, then where am I? That question doesn't need an answer yet. It's enough that it appears. The observer doesn't comment. It doesn't judge. It doesn't try to improve you. It simply sees. And because it doesn't react, it creates stillness around whatever is happening. You begin to notice how quickly the character steps in, how it defends, explains, justifies, how it wants to be right, to be seen a certain way, to avoid discomfort. You don't argue with it. You just watch it move. And something interesting happens when you watch without interference. The reaction often softens on its own. Not always, but often enough that you start to trust the process. You see that emotions don't need to be managed as much as they need to be allowed, that thoughts lose some of their authority when they're observed instead of believed. This observation doesn't make life easier in an immediate way. In fact, it can make things feel more raw at first. You notice habits you used to ignore. You see contradictions you once smoothed over. You become aware of how often you act from fear, from momentum, from the desire to maintain an image. But awareness isn't cruel, it's honest. And honesty, even when uncomfortable, carries a strange sense of relief. There's less effort in pretending not to see, less energy spent holding the character together. You're not trying to escape yourself anymore. You're meeting yourself. You might also notice that this observing presence doesn't feel personal in the way the character does. It doesn't have a story. It doesn't need to be defended. It doesn't get offended. It doesn't rush. It feels stable, even when everything else is moving. It's there when you're calm. It's there when you're anxious. It's there when you're confident and when you're unsure. The content of experience changes, but this seeing does not. That realization can be disorienting. If there is something in you that watches thoughts, then thoughts cannot be the core of who you are. If there is something that notices emotions, then emotions are not your identity either. They are experiences happening within a wider field. You don't need to turn this into a belief. You don't need to label it. It's enough to notice the difference between being lost in experience and being aware of experience. The game relies on identification. It works best when you believe you are the thoughts, the emotions, the roles, the reactions. Observation loosens that belief, not by arguing with it, but by outgrowing it. You may start to feel less compelled to react immediately, less interested in defending every position, less hooked by drama that once felt urgent. Not because you're superior, but because you're no longer as merged. This can change how you move through the world. Conversations feel different. Silence feels safer. You listen more, you speak more slowly, or sometimes not at all. You begin to sense when words are coming from habit rather than truth. At the same time, the observer doesn't withdraw you from life. It actually brings you closer. You feel sensations more clearly. You notice subtleties. You sense when something resonates and when it doesn't. Life becomes less about control and more about contact. And gradually, another realization starts to form. If you can observe the character, if you can see the game being played, then you are not the player in the way you once thought. You are not the role trying to win. You are not the voice narrating the story. You are the awareness in which all of this appears. This understanding doesn't arrive as a dramatic conclusion. It arrives as a quiet shift in perspective, a sense of standing slightly back, yet more present than ever. And once this perspective takes hold, even gently, the entire structure of the game begins to feel less solid. The realization doesn't arrive with fireworks. It comes quietly, almost casually, and that's what makes it so powerful. You're going about your day thinking, reacting, deciding, and suddenly it's clear that all of this is happening in front of you, not as you. Thoughts appear, emotions move, the body acts, and yet something in you is simply present, untouched by the movement. You're not stepping out of life, you're seeing life from a deeper place. For most of your life, you assumed you were the one thinking the thoughts, choosing the reactions, driving the story forward. That's how the game is taught. You are the player, responsible for every move, every outcome. Win or lose, succeed or fail. But now, that assumption loosens. You notice that thoughts arise on their own. You don't select them from a menu. They appear, fully formed, and then disappear. The same with emotions. A wave of anxiety, a surge of excitement, a pull toward irritation. They show up before you can decide anything about them. If they arise on their own, then what exactly are you? This question isn't philosophical in the abstract sense, it's experiential. You feel it. There is a clear difference between the movement and the noticing of the movement, between the sound and the hearing of the sound, between the thought and the awareness of the thought. The more you rest in this noticing, the more stable it feels. Awareness doesn't strain, it doesn't push, it doesn't compete, it doesn't need to prove anything. It simply allows whatever is happening to be seen as it is. And because it doesn't resist, it isn't disturbed in the way the character is. This changes your relationship to the game in a fundamental way. You still participate. You still make decisions. You still show up. But the weight shifts, the urgency softens. The sense that everything depends on getting it right begins to dissolve. Not because you stop caring, but because you see that the game was never holding your identity in the first place. You are not the piece moving across the board. You are the space in which the board appears. At first, this can feel destabilizing. The character wants ground to stand on. It wants certainty, it wants a clear role. Awareness offers none of that. It offers openness. And openness can feel like nothing until you recognize it as everything you've been standing on all along. This doesn't make you passive. It makes you responsive. Instead of reacting automatically, you sense into what's happening. You notice impulses without immediately obeying them. You feel emotions without being swallowed by them. Choices become less about fear and more about clarity. The game's threats lose some of their bite. Failure no longer feels like a collapse of self. Success no longer feels like proof of worth. Both are events, movements within the field of experience, meaningful but not defining. You may notice a strange freedom here, not the freedom to do whatever you want, but the freedom to not be compelled in the same way, the freedom to pause, to say no, to let moments pass without grabbing onto them. This is where the game starts to feel thin. Its rules rely on identification, on the belief that you are the role, the outcome, the story. Awareness quietly withdraws that belief, not through rebellion, but through clarity. When you see the mechanics, the magic fades. You begin to recognize how much of the game runs on fear. Fear of not being enough, fear of falling behind, fear of being excluded. When you're identified with the character, these fears feel existential. When you're aware of the character, they feel like signals, not threats. They can still arise, but they no longer define the center. You may also notice compassion emerging unexpectedly, not as a moral effort, but as a natural response. When you see that you've been playing a game you didn't choose, you also see that everyone else is doing the same. The same conditioning, the same fears, the same search for security. The urge to judge softens. At the same time, something becomes very clear. The game cannot control awareness, it can distract it. It can cover it up, but it cannot touch it. Awareness was present before the rules were learned. It will be present after they're questioned. This is not an idea to adopt. It's something to notice again and again, in simple moments, while breathing, while listening, while feeling a reaction rise and fall. Each time you notice, the identification loosens a little more. And as it loosens, the game loses one of its main supports. Because a game can only function when you believe you are the player struggling to win. When you realize you are the awareness of the game, the struggle changes shape. The moves still happen, but the desperation fades. The need to prove, to defend, to constantly improve begins to relax. The game doesn't end all at once, but it can no longer hide. Once observation becomes steady, the game starts to weaken in ways that are impossible to reverse. Not because you fight it, not because you reject it, but because you see it. The game depends on unconscious participation. It needs you to be fully inside the role, reacting automatically, taking every thought personally, treating every emotion as a command. Observation interrupts that cycle without effort. The moment something is seen clearly, it loses the ability to operate in the same way. You begin to notice patterns instead of problems. A familiar trigger appears, and instead of being pulled into the usual reaction, you watch the sequence unfold. A thought arises, the body tightens. A story tries to form, and in that seeing, something stalls. The reaction doesn't complete itself the way it used to. It's not that nothing happens, it's that the momentum changes. The game relies on speed, on immediate identification, on the assumption that there is no gap between stimulus and response. Observation introduces a pause, and in that pause, the rules stop working as expected. You might still feel the urge to defend yourself, but you notice it before it takes over. You might still feel fear, but it no longer feels absolute. It's a sensation moving through awareness, not a verdict about reality. This is how the game starts to dissolve, quietly, internally. From the outside, your life may look the same. You still go to work, you still have relationships, you still handle responsibilities, but the inner structure has shifted. You are no longer feeding the system in the same way. The game needs belief to survive. Belief that your thoughts are facts. Belief that your emotions define you. Belief that the role you play is who you are. Observation doesn't argue with these beliefs. It simply sees through them. And once seen through, they can't fully regain their authority. You may notice this most clearly in moments that used to hook you completely. Criticism, praise, comparison, conflict. Where there was once a quick contraction, there is now space. Where there was once urgency, there is now curiosity. What's actually happening here? That question doesn't come from doubt, it comes from clarity. The game also starts to reveal its incentives. You see how it pulls attention toward outcomes, toward validation, toward endless improvement. You notice how it keeps the future more important than the present, and instead of being swept along, you observe the pull itself. That observation weakens the pull. This can feel disorienting at times. The game has provided structure for a long time. When its grip loosens, there can be a sense of groundlessness. If you're not chasing the usual rewards, what motivates you? If you're not reacting in the usual ways, who are you becoming? The mind wants answers. The observer doesn't rush to give them. It trusts the process of seeing. You might notice that certain dramas lose their appeal. Not because you're above them, but because you see the mechanism clearly. The emotional charge drains when it's no longer fed by identification. The same patterns repeat around you, but you're less inclined to step into them. This doesn't make you passive, it makes you precise. You respond when response is needed. You act when action is aligned, and you don't act when the impulse comes from conditioning rather than clarity. This discernment wasn't learned. It emerged naturally from observation. The game tries to adapt, of course. It always does. It may present more subtle narratives, spiritual identity, intellectual superiority, the idea that you've figured it out. These are just new costumes, and because you're observing, you see them too. Nothing is excluded from awareness. That's why the game cannot survive here. It cannot hide. It cannot operate in the dark when the lights are on. Every move it makes is seen as a move. Every story is recognized as a story. This doesn't mean the character disappears. It means it's no longer in charge. You might still feel emotions strongly. You might still have preferences, opinions, desires, but they move within awareness, not as awareness. They don't define the center anymore. This creates a kind of inner honesty that can't be undone. You know when you're acting from fear. You know when you're performing. You know when you're aligned and when you're not, and because you see it, you can't fully pretend otherwise. Pretending requires unconsciousness. The game thrives on people not noticing what they're doing. Once you notice even a little, participation becomes optional. You can still play when it's useful. You can still engage with the world, but you're no longer trapped by the need to win, to prove, to protect an identity. The pressure eases, and in that easing, something unexpected happens. Life starts to feel more immediate. Sounds are clearer, moments are fuller. There's less narration, less commentary, less mental noise. The observer doesn't live in the future or the past. It lives here, and as observation deepens, the question quietly shifts. Not how do I play better, but what happens now that I see? That question doesn't demand an answer. It opens a doorway. When the game ends, it doesn't collapse dramatically. There's no explosion, no clear line that says before and after. Most of the time, nothing on the outside changes at all, and that's why it's easy to misunderstand what's actually happening. You don't wake up free from responsibility. You don't suddenly escape the world. You don't stop participating in life. What ends is something quieter but far more important. What ends is the belief. The belief that you must constantly become someone else to be okay. The belief that life is a test you're always about to fail. The belief that your worth depends on how well you perform inside the rules. When you see the game clearly, those beliefs lose their grip. Not because you replace them with better beliefs, but because you see they were never solid to begin with. This can feel confusing at first. There's a strange emptiness where urgency used to be. The pressure that once drove you starts to fade, and for a moment, you may wonder what's left. If you're not chasing, fixing, proving, or defending, what exactly are you doing here? The mind wants to turn this into a problem. It wants a new objective, a new identity, a new version of success. But this is where the misunderstanding often happens. The end of the game is not the end of movement. It's the end of compulsion. You still act, but the action comes from clarity rather than fear. You still make choices, but they're no longer fueled by the need to secure your existence. You still care, but the care is cleaner, less desperate. The game taught you that life is something to manage. Awareness reveals that life is something to participate in. This shift can feel subtle, but it changes everything. You begin to notice how much energy was tied up in resistance, resisting what is, resisting how you feel, resisting not knowing. When the game loosens, that resistance softens too. You don't become passive. You become available. Available to what's actually happening instead of what you think should be happening. Available to respond instead of react. Available to feel without immediately needing to explain or justify the feeling. This is why the end of the game can feel anticlimactic. There's no grand reward waiting on the other side, no permanent high, no final answer, just a quieter, more direct relationship with experience. And that's exactly what the character was always afraid of. The character thrives on drama, tension, and forward motion. It needs something to chase or avoid. When those drivers fall away, the character doesn't disappear, but it relaxes. It stops running the show. You may still notice old patterns arising, old fears, old habits of thought. but they appear more like echoes than commands. They pass through awareness without defining it. Life continues to bring challenges. Loss still hurts. Uncertainty still appears. But these experiences are no longer interpreted as evidence that something is wrong with you. They're recognized as part of being alive, not as failures in the game. This is where a deeper honesty emerges. You stop pretending to have everything figured out. You stop needing life to make sense in order to live it. You allow ambiguity without rushing to close it. And strangely, this openness brings more steadiness than certainty ever did. The end of the game doesn't give you answers. It gives you presence. Presence with discomfort. Presence with joy. Presence with not knowing what comes next. And presence changes the quality of everything. You may notice that moments feel fuller, even when they're simple. A conversation, a walk, a pause between tasks. Without the constant mental overlay of, what does this mean for me? Experience becomes more immediate, more intimate. This doesn't make life smaller. It makes it closer. You're no longer living as a concept of yourself moving through a concept of the world. You're living as awareness meeting what's here, moment by moment. And that meeting doesn't need to be impressive to be real. The game promised fulfillment in the future. Awareness reveals fulfillment as a way of relating to the present. That doesn't mean everything feels good. It means everything is allowed. Nothing needs to be filtered through the lens of winning or losing. Nothing needs to justify your existence. And yet even here, something continues. Life doesn't stop asking things of you. Situations still require action. Decisions still arise. The difference is that these movements are no longer anchored in the illusion that you are a character, trapped inside a system that defines you. You move from a different center now, not from fear of falling behind, but from a quiet sense of alignment. Not from obligation, but from clarity. Not from the need to escape the game, but from seeing that you were never confined by it in the first place. This is why the end of the game is not an escape from life. It's an entrance into it. And as this becomes more familiar, another realization begins to take shape almost on its own, that the game was only able to feel so real because it was never questioned, because it was never seen clearly. Now that it has been seen, something else becomes possible. The game was never as powerful as it seemed. It only felt real because it was invisible. As long as you were inside it, reacting, identifying, trying to win, it shaped your life without resistance. But the moment you saw it, something irreversible happened. You didn't escape the world, you didn't become someone else. You simply stopped mistaking the role for who you are. Nothing needs to be forced now. Awareness is already here. It notices your thoughts without obeying them. It feels emotions without being owned by them. It allows life to move without turning every moment into a test. This is not a destination. It's a way of being present, honest and free inside whatever is happening. If this resonated with you, write this sentence in the comments so I know you stayed until the end. I see the game and I choose awareness. And if this content spoke to you and you want to go deeper, watch one of the videos appearing on your screen now. They continue this exploration in a practical, grounded way.